Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to our regularly scheduled program on Friday evenings, which is Analyzing the Address, where we revisit the khutbah, talk about it in a little bit additional detail, provide additional context and information that we're unable to mention given the time constraints of the khutbah, and also offer you the opportunity to provide any feedback and to ask any questions that you may have pertaining to the khutbah. The title of today's khutbah was "The Believers Are Like a Single Body," and it's centered around the hadith collected by Imam Muslim on the authority of Nu'man ibn Bashir, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam he said, مثل المؤمنين في توادهم وتراحمهم وتعاطفهم مثل الجسد الواحد إذا اشتكى منه عضو تداعى له سائر الجسد بالسهر والحمى. He said the likeness of the believers in their mutual love, compassion, and concern is like that of a single body. If one limb feels pain, the rest of the body rallies together, sharing in its suffering through sleeplessness and fever. And there's a few points that I wanted to make, or I wanted to revisit from the khutbah. And the first one was the passage in the khutbah where we mentioned, we asked the question, we said, مثل المؤمنين في أي شيء. We said that the Prophet opened the hadith, the likeness of the believers, and then we asked the likeness of the believers in what thing exactly? And the answer comes from the Prophet in the hadith, في توادهم وتراحمهم وتعاطفهم. The likeness of the believers in terms of their mutual love, compassion, and concern. And in that passage we said, this sends the implicit message that loving the believers, having compassion for them, and being concerned about their well-being is part of believing and a sign of true belief. While the opposite, despising the believers, treating them heartlessly, and being indifferent toward their suffering, although it doesn't make us disbelievers. Any one or any combination of those three doesn't make us disbelievers, but it is an indication that we are not members of the fraternity of the faithful to the extent that Allah wants us to be. We haven't believed, we are lacking in faith, and we haven't believed to the degree that Allah expects and requires. And here I wanted to mention or expand on this point by saying that al-iman fil qalb, the heart, the belief or the faith that is in a person's heart, it can't be seen. It's not something that can be perceived per se by the senses. But the indicators of faith, or the indicators of the existence of faith, or the presence of faith in the heart, can be seen, can be perceived by the senses. And iman, faith, it has signs, it has indicators. So it's wrong to say, you don't know what's in my heart, which is a lot of Muslims do. They might talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And then when they're called up on that, when they're taken to task about that, they say, you don't know what's in my heart. As if the outside is divorced from the inside. As if a person can be a perfect believer on the inside and show no indication of that on the outside. That's wrong. The Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, he said, أَلَا فِي الْجَسْدِ مُضْغَةٍ إِذَا صَلَحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسْدُ كُلُّهُ وَإِذَا فَسَدَتْ فَسَدَ الْجَسْدُ كُلُّهُ أَلَا وَهِيَ الْقَلْبِ. He said, certainly there is a lump of body in the flesh that if it is sound, pure, and upright, the whole body will be sound, pure, and upright. And if it is foul and corrupt, the whole body will be foul and corrupt. Is it not? Certainly it is the heart. Meaning that if you have iman, 100% iman, a heart filled with iman on the inside, that's going to reflect on the outside. La mahala. That the two are inseparably connected, that what's on the inside is going to come out on the outside. If you have 50% iman, we're going to see 50% iman on your limbs. And for this reason, you find the Prophet ﷺ telling us in a number of hadith, this being one of them, that iman has what? Has signs. There are certain things that a believer will do if they truly believe. And things that if you don't truly believe or you have issues in your faith, you won't do or you will do. There are signs and indicators. So for example, in this hadith, we mentioned the signs in this hadith, but we also have other hadith. For example, the Prophet said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. It's a sign of faith. When you don't have that, when you're not able to get yourself to do that, to love for your brother what you love for yourself, it's a sign that your faith is what? Lacking. It's an indicator. Something we can see, we can perceive that. Also the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, he said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من ولدي ووالده والناس أجمعين. He said, none of you truly believes until I am more beloved to him. Meaning the Prophet ﷺ is more beloved to him than his own father, his own son, and all of mankind, without exception. That's a sign, it's an indicator. That's something we others can perceive, and we certainly can perceive ourselves. Do we really love the Prophet more than anyone else in the world? The Prophet said in the one hadith, he said, Wallahi la yu'min, Wallahi la yu'min, Wallahi la yu'min. He said, by Allah, I swear by Allah, he doesn't believe, he doesn't believe, he doesn't believe. His companion said, Man ya Rasulullah? Who's the one who doesn't believe? He said, Man la ya'man jaruhu bawa'iqah. He said, the one who his neighbor is not safe from his harm, his mistreatment, his annoyance, his nuisance. That's a sign. That's an indicator. And so it's important, brothers and sisters, for us to first acknowledge that these indicators exist. And that what's in the heart is not separated from what's occurring on the limbs. The way we speak, the way we behave, the way we go about our business. And once we do that, we have to make it a point to familiarize ourselves with these alamat or amarat, these signs of faith. Familiarize ourselves. We need to know what they are. And then we need to strive to exhibit them. That's the whole purpose why the Prophet is saying this. So that the believers will strive to exemplify, to embody these qualities, which are the manifestations of Iman. Then we need to make regular personal assessments of ourselves based upon these indicators. Hold ourselves up to the light of these indicators to see where we are on the continuum of faith. Are we trending closer to al-mu'min kamil iman, the Muslim whose his iman has come full circle, his faith is complete? Or are we trending towards what? Al-Muslim naqis ul-iman or al-kafir, the Muslim whose faith is deficient, or the Muslim or the person who has no faith at all? Which direction are we trending on the continuum? We have to make these assessments on a regular basis and hold ourselves up to the light of these indicators. And number 3, we need to call ourselves to account in this world before we go to the place when we'll be called to account by Allah. We need to call ourselves to account. You know what? I don't take these, for example, these 3 that we mentioned. I have some, for example, a person could say, or a Muslim could hold himself to account and say, you know, sometimes I feel a certain level of, I harbor a certain level of animosity, contempt. I despise certain Muslims, certain believers. I despise them, not because of something they did, but something which is no fault of their own. If I have this towards believers, I need to realize that that's wrong. I need to bring myself to account. I need to take myself to the woodshed, and I need to rectify my behavior. We have to do this, brother. This is why the Prophet is teaching us this, so we can get our affairs in order in this world before we meet Allah in the next. ثم بعد ذلك, we transition in the khutbah to the next phrase in the hadith, مثل الجسد الواحد, the likeness of a single body. And we mentioned the other hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, المؤمن المؤمن كالبنيان يشد بعضه بعضا وشبك بين أصابعه where the Prophet, he said, one believer to another is like a solid structure. One part supports the other, and he interlocked or interlaced his fingers. And so we mention how these two ahadith, both of them describe the extraordinary level of solidarity, cooperation, and affection that is supposed to exist in the Muslim community. And it also teaches us conversely, there's also the opposite message is also being conveyed. And that is that at-tashattut wa tafarruq madmuman, that disunity, division, acrimonious discord amongst the believers is something which is strongly, vehemently disapproved of in Islam. Why? Because it weakens us spiritually. Not only does it weaken us spiritually, we talked about how the sign of Iman, or one of the signs of Iman, is when you have this love, this compassion, this concern for your brothers, for your fellow believers. So when you don't have that, when you have the opposite, what does that do? It decreases, depreciates your Iman, it weakens us spiritually. But on top of that, it also weakens us materially, physically. We become weak. When we have this acrimonious discord, this disunity, this division, then we're weak materially, physically weak. And our weakness can be exploited by our enemies. Our physical weakness can be exploited by our enemies. One of the mantras and slogans of the enemies of Islam has always been farriq tasud, divide and conquer. And they have definitely employed this strategy against us throughout the centuries. Abr al-Qurun. And they've used it in different ways, or they've employed it in different ways, but they've employed it very effectively. And I'll give a few. I'll mention a few. One of them is they created these nations that did not exist previously, but they created the nation. They created these nations. They carved up parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, the Indo-Pak subcontinent, carved it up. And they did that with the intention of what? Of achieving this objective, farriq tasud, divide and conquer. Because the result is that Muslims who used to consider themselves Muslims and to basically link their destiny with the destiny of their brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, other regions, began to look at themselves first and foremost as what? As Saudi, Jordanian, Iraqi, Syrian, Egyptian, Moroccan, Indian, Pakistani, Kashmiri. They start to look at themselves as what? In terms of their nation. First, and Muslim second, if at all. And as a result, that what? That weakens us physically. We're not connected anymore, and we don't feel that our destinies are connected. And we don't care if they suffer as long as we what? We succeed. Even if we succeed at their expense. This is one way that they did it. Another way they did it is they exploited tribal differences. And you'll find this if you research some of the countries during the Mandate period and after the Mandate period, when they were trying to move toward independence. You see how the forces, these neo-colonial forces came in, they exploited tribal differences to do what? To prevent the countries from ever being able to what? To really, really self-determine. Because a house divided cannot stand. Another way they did it was they created these theological and juristic schisms. And if they didn't create them, they did what? They certainly what? Exploited them to their advantage. So you have Muslims who are Sufi, Muslims who are Shi'i, Muslims who are Sunni, Muslims who are Mu'tazili, Muslims who are Ash'ari. You have all these different theological schisms, and you also have juristic schisms. Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and others. And so these schisms create what? They separate us, they divide us. They put us at odds with one another. Such that I don't look at you as my brother, I don't look at you as my friend, I look at you as my enemy, as my opponent. All of these have been exploited, and others have been exploited. Other means of farriq tasud, divide and conquer, have been exploited or used to sow the seeds and fan the flames of enmity. And this prevents the Muslims from being like what? Like what the Prophet described and what the Prophet encouraged and required, in fact, methodul jasad al-wahid, like a single body. And so we have to understand what is happening, and we have to understand that we are obligated to undo what has been done. And not to just go with the flow and accept things as they are, accept the status quo. No, we have to take things back to what the Prophet intended. The Messenger of Allah intended, how they're supposed to be methodul jasad al-wahid. Then thumma ba'd dhalik, we mentioned the last phrase of the hadith in which the Prophet, he clarified what that looks like in a practical sense. He said, مثل الجسد الواحد إذا اشتكى منه عضو تداعى له سائر الجسد بالسهر والحمى. He said, if one limb feels pain, if one part of the body is suffering, the rest of the body rallies together, sharing in its suffering through sleeplessness and fever. What's important here, brothers and sisters, is to realize that this only works. This is beautiful, what the Prophet said. And it's akin to the statement of the Prophet that we mentioned earlier when he said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. These are beautiful words, and they are words that if we implement them, they will create a type of solidarity, a type of unity, a type of harmony that is unprecedented. It doesn't have a match, it doesn't have a peer. But this only works if it is reciprocal. If all of the believers pull in the same direction and practice this, if they all do the same thing and apply this. If only one group does that, and the other group doesn't find, that group that does it, doesn't find it reciprocated by other what? Other members of the body of believers, then pretty soon that group becomes resentful. Resentment sets in, and they decide to check out and not to participate and do as they've been instructed, like the others have checked out and not done as they've been instructed. And I'll give you a practical example. I remember once, a few years back, I was attending a Friday worship service, Jumu'ah, in a masjid, a particular masjid. And it was very diverse because it was in a university town. And the khatib, he was giving the khutbah, and this was right around the time when, the president before Sisi, before him, I forget his name, but the president before him was overthrown. Right around that time. And there was a lot of protesting going on in Egypt. And the new government was crushing those protests with violence and brutality and even with bloodshed. And this Egyptian brother was giving this impassioned speech about what was going on and the violation of civil and human rights that the Egyptians were suffering from, those who were protesting, what had happened, and how we need to come, Mursi, Jazakallah khair. So we need to come together and come to the aid of our brothers in Egypt and so on and so forth. And I remember he was giving the khutbah, brothers and sisters. And I remember this brother from the Indo-Pak subcontinent. I remember he stood up and he said, we don't want to hear about Egypt. We don't want to hear about Egypt, and we don't have any sympathy for you and the Egyptians. You're only speaking about Egypt because you're Egyptian. And I've come to this mosque for weeks after weeks, and Burma is on fire. And Muslims in Burma are being burned alive. And I haven't heard a single khutbah about Burma. So I don't want to hear a single khutbah about Egypt. That's what he said, subhanAllah. And wallahi, that struck me. Because I'm not saying what he said is right, but I can understand why he said what he said. We can't be selective. And when we're selective, when only certain Muslims matter, certain Muslims' problems matter, then the other Muslims check out. They say, okay, we're not a body. We are Syrians, so let the Syrians worry about the Syrians. We're Egyptians, so let the Egyptians worry about the Egyptians. And let us, people from the subcontinent, or even us, particular countries in the subcontinent, Kashmiris worry about Kashmir. Bangladeshis worry about Bangladesh. And Pakistanis worry about Pakistan. That's what it'll come to, brothers, if we don't all pull in the same direction, and if these virtues and these moral duties are not reciprocal. If they're not practiced with reciprocity. طيب. And that's why in the second khutbah we open by saying, in this hadith our beloved Prophet ﷺ is describing the relationship between the believers as it should be, not necessarily as it is, and he is indirectly commissioning us to make this a reality. He's ordering us, commissioning us to make this a reality. So what that means is, brothers and sisters, we all have to play our part in making it so. All of us. It can't be one group of the Muslims who are what? Who are pulling in that direction, and the rest are what? Resting on their laurels, not doing their part, or even pulling what? In the opposite direction. Then after that, we transitioned to talk about, to bring this beautiful hadith from a theoretical level to a practical level and show why it's so important for this hadith to be practiced today, for us to put it into practice in our communities. And we mentioned how there's so much craziness in the world going on around us. We mentioned the natural disasters, the earthquakes, the wildfires, the lethal storm systems. We mentioned this global health crisis of COVID-19. We mentioned the persecution of Muslims because they are Muslims in places like China and Burma and India and elsewhere. We mentioned that an entire people is actively being stripped of their land, their identity, and their dignity with impunity in occupied Palestine. We mentioned the world's worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And we mentioned the corruption and the instability in many of the countries that Muslims call home. And these are just a few examples that we could mention of what the craziness in the world. Then we talked about, add to that, the personal problems all of us are dealing with. Each and every one of us in his own life, in his own home, his own personal circumstance, is facing some difficulty, facing some hardship, without exception. There's not a single one of us who isn't facing, for example, unemployment, financial difficulty, debt, illness, your own illness, or the illness of a loved one. Perhaps dysfunctional families. A lot of us in this country have children who've grown up in this country, and perhaps they're rebelling. Some of them maybe want to disbelieve, want to apostate, or they're questioning the faith, or they're dating, or they're doing this or doing that. This is an issue that Muslims are dealing with. Also, marital problems. Couples feel that their relationships are what? Are coming undone at the seams. These and other issues people are dealing with. The list can go on and on and on, and we mentioned that with all of this stuff going on in the world, in our personal lives, what can easily happen is that depression and despair can set in, especially if any individual Muslim feels that they have to face all of these things all alone. There's nobody standing with me. There's nobody propping me up. I don't have a support system. I don't have fellow believers. Yeah, we say we're Muslim, we say we're a community, but I don't feel it. So I feel alone. There's no tangible manifestation of it. So it's like what? I'm all by myself. If they feel like that, people can become depressed, they can fall into despair, etc. And we said that all of this underscores the importance of applying the Prophet's words. And we have to, brothers and sisters, the message I was trying to send here is that we have to stop just paying lip service to these religious intricacies. See, Muslims at large, they can pray. They can pray 5 times a day. They can fast Ramadan. They can make Hajj once in a lifetime. They can make zakat if there's zakatable. Most of us can do that. It's the intricacies. This is where a lot of us, we falter. This is where a lot of us don't give the due attention. This is where a lot of us don't read the fine print, or we read the fine print and then say, come on, man, Allah Kareem. I pray. I fast. That's good enough. We have to stop paying lip service to this, why it's so important now more than ever before. Because with all the stuff that's going on, all of the sawadif, all the difficulties and hardships that we're facing, more and more Muslims are going to be picked apart by these difficulties. They're going to falter in terms of their faith and their commitment. They're going to fall into depression and despair. Why? Because they feel alone. Nobody should have to face this alone. That's why the Prophet is encouraging the believers to be what? Jasadun wahid. A single body. One Muslim is suffering, one Muslim is hurting, you prop him up. You stand with him, you support him. Then we close by saying that COVID-19, we realize it has made our efforts of being a closely knit community. It has made realizing those efforts difficult, but it hasn't made it impossible. It just means we have to work harder. We have to work harder, and some of the things that we need to do, they're not that difficult to do. They just take a little extra effort. We talked about when you see a Muslim, even practicing social distancing in the masjid. We meet each other every Friday. How many times have Muslims just walked past each other, don't even give salams, let alone ask, how are you doing, brother? Is everything okay? Are you all right? Is there anything you need? Is there something I can do to help? We just don't hear these things, but we should. Those of us who don't see each other, aren't able to see each other on a regular basis, email, call, text. Hey, just checking in. And if your brother asks you for support, and sometimes the support can come in something as simple as just needing an ear, needing a shoulder, figuratively, to cry on, just needing a vent. How many of us will make time, will be there? A lot of people won't. You have those experiences where you call somebody and say, yeah, I'm having these problems, and the person changes the subject. Or the person rushes you off the phone as if, I don't want to be burdened with your problems. Where is this in comparison to the words of the Prophet who said, مَثَلُ الْجَسَدِ الْوَاحِدِ إِذَا اشْتَكَى مِنْهُ عُضْوٌ تَدَاعَى لَهُ سَائِرُ الْجَسَدِ بِالسَّهْرِ وَالْحُمَّةِ. Is this consistent with what the Prophet said? If a part of the body feels pain, the rest of it rallies together and shares in that pain and sleeplessness and fever, and we can't even give a person 5 minutes, 10 minutes to just vent. Sometimes that's all a person needs, and we can't even do that. Shame on us. And so, I want to warn us, issue a warning, that people are becoming disillusioned and disenchanted with Islam because of the cruelty and because of the indifference of many Muslims towards their fellow Muslims, especially when they juxtapose that to how kind many Muslims are to non-Muslims. Muslims go out of their way to be kind to non-Muslims. Not saying that's wrong, especially given the circumstances that we live in and the environment that we live in. But just imagine the stake that you're driving in a Muslim's heart when you have no time for them, when you can't lend a hand to help them. But when the non-Muslims call you, you're tripping over yourself to run to them. So brothers and sisters, I want us to contemplate this hadith, but not just contemplate it. Think about it in light of our own behavior, and let us take ourselves to account, change our behavior, and make it more compliant and consistent with these beautiful words of our Prophet, مَثَلُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ فِي تَوَادِّهِمْ وَتَرَاحُمِهِمْ وَتَعَاطُفِهِمْ مَثَلُ الْجَسَدِ الْوَاحِدِ. إذا اشتكى منه عضو تداعى له سائر الجسد بالسهر والحمى. The likeness of the believers in terms of their mutual love, compassion, and concern is the likeness of a single body. If one part of it feels pain, the rest of the body rallies together, sharing in that pain and sleeplessness and fever. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us like that. May He make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it. May He make us from those who He teaches beneficial knowledge and who He truly benefits from that knowledge by making us from those who put it into practice. Ameen, ameen, ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Nabi Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.